She called the village of Las Pasturas beautiful. She had gotten used to the loneliness, but she had never accepted its people. She was the daughter of farmers, but the dream was true. It was as I had seen it. Ultima knew. But you will not be like them. She caught her breath and stopped, kissed my forehead. You will be like my brothers. You will be a Luna, Antonio. You will be a man of the people, and perhaps a priest. She smiled. A priest, I thought. That was her dream. I was to hold Mass on Sundays like Father Burns did in the church in town. I was to hear the confessions of the silent people of the valley, and I was to administer the Holy Sacrament to them. Perhaps, I said. Yes, my mother smiled. She held me tenderly. The fragrance of her body was sweet. But then, who will hear my confession? What? Nothing, I answered. I felt a cool sweat on my forehead, and I knew I had to run. I had to clear my mind of the dream. I'm going to Jason's house, I said hurriedly, and slid past my mother. I ran out the kitchen door, past the animal pens, toward Jason's house. The white sun and the fresh air cleansed me. On this side of the river, there were only 3 houses. The slope of the hill rose gradually into the hills of the juniper and mesquite and cedar clumps. Jason's house was farther away from the river than our house. On the path that led to the bridge lived huge, fat Fio and his beautiful wife. Fio and my father worked together on the highway. They were good drinking friends. Jason? I called at the kitchen door. I had run hard and was panting. His mother appeared at the door. Jason no está aquí, she said. All of the older people spoke only Spanish, and I myself only understood Spanish. It was only after one went to school that one learned English. ¿Dónde está? I asked. She pointed towards the river. Northwest, past the railroad tracks, to the dark hills. The river came through those hills, and there were old Indian grounds there. Holy burial grounds, Jason told me. There, in an old cave, lived an Indian. At least everybody called him Jason's Indian. He was the only Indian of the town, and he talked only to Jason. Jason's father had forbidden Jason to talk to the Indian. He had beaten him. He had tried in every way to keep Jason from the Indian. But Jason persisted. Jason was not a bad boy. He was just Jason. He was quiet and moody, and sometimes for no reason at all, was wild and loud with sounds that came exploding from his throat and lungs. Sometimes I felt like Jason, like I wanted to shout and cry, but I never did. I looked at his mother's eyes, and I saw they were sad. Thank you, I said, and returned home. While I waited for my father to return with Ultima, I worked in the garden. Every day I had to work in the garden. Every day I reclaimed from the rocky soil of the hill and a few more feet of earth to cultivate. The land of the Llano was no good for farming. The good land was along the river. But my mother wanted a garden, and I worked to make her happy. Already we had a few chile and tomato plants growing. It was hard work. My fingers bled from scraping out the rocks, and it seemed that a square yard of ground produced a wheelbarrow full of rocks, which I had to push down to the retaining wall. The sun was white in the bright blue sky. The shade of the clouds would not come until the afternoon. The sweat was sticky on my brown body. I heard the truck and turned to see it chugging up the dusty goat path. My father was returning with Ultima. Mama, I called. My mother came running out, Deborah and Teresa following after her. I'm afraid, I heard Teresa whimper. There's nothing to be afraid of, Deborah said confidently. My mother said there was too much Mare's blood in Deborah. Her eyes and her hair were very dark, and she was always running. She had been to school 2 years, and she spoke only English. She was teaching Teresa, and half the time I didn't understand. Madre de Dios, but mind your manners, my mother scolded. The truck stopped and she ran to greet Ultima. Buenos dias, le de Dios grande, my mother cried. She smiled and hugged and kissed the old woman. Ay, Maria Luna, Ultima smiled. Buenos dias, de Dios, a ti y tu familia. She wrapped the black shawl around her hair and shoulders. Her face was brown and very wrinkled. When she smiled, her teeth were brown. I remembered the dream. Come, come, my mother urged us forward. It was the custom to greet the old. Deborah, my mother urged. Deborah stepped forward and she took Ultima's withered hand. Buenos dias, grande, she smiled. She even bowed slightly. Then she pulled Teresa forward and told her to greet La Grande. My mother beamed. Deborah's good manners surprised her, but they made her happy because a family was judged by its manners. What beautiful daughters you have raised. Ultima nodded to my mother. Nothing could have pleased my mother more. She looked proudly at my father, who stood leaning against the truck, watching and judging the introductions. Antonio, he said simply. I stepped forward and took Ultima's hand. I looked up into her clear brown eyes and shivered.